We're moving into the book of Daniel, and I want to continue this morning in our sixth week. And we've been walking through this Old Testament book that when you take this book and you put it in the context of history, it actually fits in a very well-documented time in human history. Really interesting is that the Babylonian Empire, it is an empire that arose and is accounted in human history very clearly. It rose and became a dominant empire in the world. They conquered lands, they conquered people. The emperor or the king of Babylon was truly the most powerful leader on the planet at the time that we pick up in this story. And so the book of Daniel is layered in this certain period of human history, and we're getting a chance to look at God working amidst circumstances that you can read about in just about any history book anywhere. But one of the interesting things about Babylon, and we've talked about this in the series, was that their mission really wasn't to conquer people physically, but it was to conquer them intellectually or around their values. That the kingdom of Babylon knew it was one thing to conquer people and enslave them, but it was another thing if they could get them to think like them, if they could get them to live like them and have values like them. And so the Babylonians had this very specific process of assimilating the people they conquered into their culture. They would educate them, they would teach them, and they would get them to begin to dream the dreams and live the values of Babylon, because they knew if they could capture their imaginations, they captured them more than physically, they captured them for their life. And so there was this process of making people Babylonian. And so the book of Daniel is a story that rises about four individuals who are living in this culture. They're being submitted to this assimilation plan, and yet their lives seem to rise out of that experience and tell a different or a distinct story. And because of that, we've been asking a series of questions that relate to us living in this culture. How does that story apply to us? And we've been answering questions like this one. Like, how do you and I live as a person who loves and follows Jesus and simultaneously engage culture without losing our identity? How do we do this? And it's one of the questions that gets asked in this text. How do we live as people of influence? How do we live as a people who may not be in the majority, but have a way of influencing the world around us? How do we live and maintain our identity as the people of God? How do we engage culture and not lose our values? How do we shape and build our neighborhoods and encourage things in our city? How do we stay active in our culture and not forget who we are as the people of God? And the whole idea that we've been talking about through the course of this series, and the reason the title is named what it's named, is that even though you and I may not be in the majority, we still have the capacity to shape culture. We still have the vision to influence values. We still have the priority of impacting people that are around us. You don't have to be in the majority to have that sort of vision or have that sort of passion or to live that sort of life. A relatively small group of people living in a particular way together can impact the world around them. Are you with me on this? And we see this in lots of different places. In fact, this is fascinating that we've experienced this in other ways. In fact, the way most of us experience one individual or a small group of people influencing a larger, it's usually negative. We don't hear the positive stories. A lot of our experiences where we say, oh yeah, that actually is true, typically they're negative. We can see these. Like, for example, how many of you have worked in a place where somebody got hired or somebody was transferred into your office or into your department or wherever you work, and that person, their influence changed the culture for bad in the place where you work? Has anybody ever experienced that? Yeah. Some of you aren't raising your hand because the person's here at church, right? But I don't want them to see, but yeah, they're over there. But that happens, right? They get hired, and all of a sudden, weeks, months later, you look back and you go, ever since that person showed up, things just kind of shifted, and it's not as good as it used to be. Same thing happens on teams, right? On teams, somebody joins the team, and all of a sudden, the dynamic on the team changes because of the relationship of that person. So one person can do that. It happens biologically. I think about this, I shouldn't think about this time of year, but when we're functioning in a normal, healthy way, we have incredible power over living things like bugs and spiders and flies. We can swat flies, we can smash bugs, we get pesticides and we kill spiders. But come into a room like this and then go into the greeting time. There are these tiny, invisible things that none of us can see that if they get inside of us will ruin our week. I know I just freaked all of you out, right? By the way, this is why I always come in after the greeting time and fist bump the people I see, right? Isn't it interesting that the tiniest almost imperceivable thing can influence our health for the negative, and all it takes is a moment. One small thing can influence the majority. So what I'm proposing is that on the opposite end of this, on the opposite end of the spectrum from the negative, is the positive, that we can have the same kind of influence, that a relatively small group of people living their lives in a particular way can influence the world and the culture around them for good. Why? Because we have influence. We have influence. And I know some of you might argue with that and you go, no, you have influence, Brad, or, I know somebody else has influence, but I don't have influence. And the reason we do that is we tell a story about who we are that isn't true. We say things like, well, I'm not really soaring in my career. I haven't reached the echelon of my career that I thought I would, or, I'm just like right now I'm on the lowest rung of the ladder professionally and I really don't have that much clout. Or maybe academically, you say, I never really soared academically. I wasn't a great student. I didn't get great grades. Or maybe you're not getting great grades. And so that's part of the story right now is you're like, you don't know how I'm struggling in these areas. Or we look at our life and decisions that we've made and we say things like, well, you don't understand the mistakes that I've made in my past and I've lost credibility. And I lost credibility with friends, or I lost credibility with family, or maybe you've lost credibility with yourself and you don't trust your own decision-making capacity. And so because of all of these things, we start to tell a story that says, I don't have influence. I don't really have influence. I don't really matter. My decisions don't really matter. My life doesn't really matter. I'm not a person of influence. By the way, that is exactly what people who are not in the majority think all the time. The majority determines how things go. The majority defines what is right. The majority is who shapes culture. And we hear this, and we experience this, and we tell ourselves this, and we start believing that our lives don't matter. We start believing that the decisions that we make don't matter. We start believing that the little things that I do behind the scenes, that they aren't that big of a deal, that they're not significant. We start believing that the way I conduct myself relationally doesn't matter. The way I use my resources, it doesn't really matter. What difference do I make? We start telling ourselves these things. But let me just tell you, every single one of us in this room, no matter where you find yourself, no matter where your story is at this given moment, you have influence. You have influence on the people around you. They're watching the decisions you make, and they see you living a particular way. And the choices that you make influence those that are around you. So you have influence. And we might say, well, some people, they have money and they have power and they have all those things. Just because you have those things doesn't mean you have influence. Every one of us have influence. And the empire wants you to believe that you don't. That's part of the strategy of Babylon, right? If you don't think that you matter, then you just kind of go along with the flow. But what we're discovering in Daniel is a new way for us to live. In fact, through the centuries, there's a couple of different ways that Christians have responded to cultural shift or change that takes place. The first one, if you've been here in the series, you know this. The first way we respond is we huddle ourselves into masses. We kind of pull ourselves together and we say, okay, let's just all get together, and we create an us versus them mentality. We disengage from culture. We hide from culture, and we get in like a time capsule and hope that somebody wakes us up in like 50 years and we're all okay. That's the way some Christians have lived, and they become disconnected from their culture and they've lost their influence. Then the other option is that individuals then begin to just be absorbed by culture. So they say, well, my decisions don't matter and I really don't make a difference. And so they just begin to live the cultural values. They become assimilated, and in the same case, they become irrelevant and they have no influence. And what Daniel is showing us is a third way to have that sort of influence, a way that we influence the culture around us without losing our identity. So how do we do this? How do we leverage that influence for good? The 6 chapters of Daniel that kind of start this book, and this is kind of an interesting thing, and I always hope everybody knows a little bit more about the Bible when we gather. The first 6 chapters of Daniel are 6 independent stories that are about interactions of Daniel and his friends with the king or the emperor of Babylon. 6 independent stories that aren't necessarily chronological in the sense that they don't run right back to each other. They're not happening one day after another. There's time between them. But each of these things are telling a story about how we become people of influence. How do we leverage our lives as an influential minority? And so today we're coming to the 5th story and the 5th chapter in this book. And as we turn the page, we see that some changes have happened. So if you were here last week, we were in Daniel chapter 4. This week, Daniel chapter 5. And I'm just going to read verse 1 because it kind of signifies a significant shift. It says this: King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. If you've been here up until this point, you've never heard of King Belshazzar. We've been talking about King Nebuchadnezzar, and these first 4 chapters were all about King Nebuchadnezzar and his interactions with these individuals. Now we have King Belshazzar. And what we know is that this is about 22 years after chapter 4 ends. So 22 years after the whole story of Nebuchadnezzar and what we looked at last week ends, now we come to chapter 5, verse 1. So some time has passed, and we don't know where Daniel has been. We don't know how monotonous his life has been. We don't know kind of what he's been spending his time with. We just know that now there's a new king, and his name is Belshazzar. And Nebuchadnezzar had died and passed his empire to his family members. Belshazzar is not necessarily the son of Nebuchadnezzar, although the text is going to say that. It's just a reference to his lineage. He's a son or a grandson. He's somewhere in the lineage of Nebuchadnezzar 22 years later. We kind of know that because the immediate descendants got assassinated by a few people. That's just in the history books. And so this guy rises up, and that's kind of his story. So about the time he's taking over, Cyrus the Great in the Persian Empire is also rising up in Persia, and his empire is getting stronger. And the Babylonian Empire at this point starts to get a little bit weaker. It's also being led not just by Belshazzar, but by a brother of sorts, whose name is Nabonidus. And Nabonidus is sort of the military leader. He's the guy that's out leading the army on the outskirts of the Babylonian Empire, defending against the Persians. And Belshazzar is like the pretty boy who stays at home and looks at himself in the mirror and throws big parties. That's basically who Belshazzar is. He's just like a political figurehead who lives in the beautiful city of Babylon while his brother's out there fighting the real fight. Now, what he doesn't know is that Nabonidus has been defeated by the Persians. And when we pick up in the story, there's some things that are going on outside of the story that are fairly significant that you'll see come to fruition when we're done. So Belshazzar, he's in charge of the nation. He's unaware of what's happened to Nabonidus, and he still believes that his city is invincible. He still believes that he is like the emperor of the universe. He thinks he's so strong. And in his arrogance, what we're reading in verse 1 and 2 is he's throwing a banquet that's dedicated not only to himself and his greatness, but he's also celebrating a Babylonian god. By the way, this banquet is known throughout history to be fairly famous. A lot of famous artists have painted this, including Rembrandt. So there's a Rembrandt painting. He called this very creatively Belshazzar's Feast. Apparently, painters aren't creative when it comes to naming their paintings. But it's this iconic painting of what happens in the story. And painters throughout history have depicted this because of its significance. So we read this in verse 2. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of the gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Let me just explain what he's talking about. Decades earlier than this moment, Nebuchadnezzar, his father or grandfather, had gone to the city of Jerusalem and had conquered Jerusalem. That's where Daniel starts, was they were all being carried away into exile. He conquered them. Nebuchadnezzar's habit, whenever he went into a nation, was to go to their temple, to go to their places of worship, and to steal their idols, to steal their gods. And during this time, every nation was polytheistic and pluralistic, and so they all worshiped this pantheon of gods, and they all had these idols. And so when he came in and beat them, it was like, well, I'm bigger than your God, and so I'm going to take your God and this idol that represents your God, and I'm going to bring it back. And he had a little collection back in Babylon. It was like, you got all the gods of the people that he conquered, and so he would bring them back here. The problem was when he went to Jerusalem, and he conquered Jerusalem, he went into their temple, and there was no idol. Why? Because the people of Israel don't worship idols. In fact, the Ten Commandments told them, you're not going to make an image of your God. So they worship an invisible God. So Nebuchadnezzar kind of scratches his head and he's like, well, how am I going to show my dominance and add this to my collection? So instead of stealing their God, he steals the instruments of worship. It would be like if somebody today came in and stole our guitars and our coffee makers at Summit. That's what it would be the equivalent of, right? We can't steal your God, but we can steal your instruments of worship, right? So they steal this stuff, they bring it back, and he's got it in his collection. And now Belshazzar, in charge of this nation and thinking he's so great, he calls this banquet together, and in this moment he asks for those things to be brought out of the storehouse because he wants to make a statement. It's this like statement, this fact, it's this sense of self-importance that he wants to proclaim over the people. Look at me and look how dominant I am. Look at my self-importance. I'm drinking from the goblets that were used in worship of the God of Israel. And he's throwing this party as an affront to anyone that would ever come against him. Verse 3 says, they brought the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. You get a little sense of the debauchery in this, don't you? Like, his wives and his concubines, they're drinking from the wine, from the glasses of this place taken out of this holy. You kind of get a sense that they're throwing it in people's faces, right? It says in verse 4, they drank wine and they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Basically the stuff of this earth. We praise the gods of our checking account balances because we own it all. That's basically what they're saying. And then we read this in verse 5. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. So, depending on how much wine you have, this is not a normal event, right? This is fairly abnormal that suddenly a finger appears and starts writing on the wall. In fact, it writes this. This is what the finger writes on the wall. This is the symbol that is written. These are the words that are used. Now, because this doesn't happen every day, we read this in verse 6. It says, then the king's color changed, his thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. In other words, the king passed out. That's basically, like he sees this and he just sort of collapses in front of everybody. And then in verse 7, after he comes to, it says, the king called loudly to bring the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, that's all these individuals, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So to go me, my brother, who I don't know has been defeated by the Persians, and then you. So you'll be the third person in line, right? So basically, whoever does this wins. Like a new car, vacation at Disneyland. That's the idea. So everybody rushes to the party. Everybody wants to win this great award. The problem is nobody knows what it says. They're all puzzled. And then if you move down in the text a little bit to verse 10, we read this. So everybody's puzzled. Nobody knows what it means. And it says, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. Now, the queen, scholars assume that this is not his wife because his wives and concubines were at the party. The assumption is this is his mother or grandmother. This is the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. So she hears what's going on. She's still alive. And so she comes in and she declares, "O king, live forever." Gets the formalities out of the way. And then she says, "Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change." That's probably the funny part of what she said. "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar." Pretty good reputation, isn't it? Like solving riddles even. You know, there's all kinds of like things that are said about Daniel. Here's this person. And so now let Daniel be called and he will show you the interpretation. So 22 years. Chapter 4 ends. 22 years. We don't know what Daniel's been doing. And all of a sudden the queen comes in and says, "You know what? I think this guy can solve your problem." And so we don't know where he had gone. We don't know what he had been doing. All we know is he must have lived in the neighborhood at this time because Daniel shows up. He comes over to this banquet and the king says to him, "Are you the guy that used to work for my father or my grandfather?" And Daniel says, "Yes, I'm that person." And then he says, "Well, will you interpret this dream? Here's what I'm going to reward you with." And Daniel says, "I don't want your money. I don't want your reward. That's not what I want." In fact, he says, "I'm going to translate this event for you. I'm going to tell you what these words mean. But first, a few words for you." And then he lays into him. It's like this drop the mic moment where he just looks at Belshazzar and he goes, "I knew your father. And when your father was young, your father was a lot like you. And he was very prideful and he was arrogant and he did all these different things." And then he says, "But your father learned a lesson of humility. And if you were here last week, you know what that lesson was." And he lived in the wilderness, grew claws like an eagle. Really strange story. But he was humbled. And when he came face to face with who God was, he recognized that and he changed and submitted himself to God. So he looks at Belshazzar and he goes, "But in that you're different than your father. You are prideful and you've not humbled yourself and you've exalted yourself against the Lord." Literally, that's the language he uses. "You've exalted yourself against him." And he points out this party, the drinking from these cups and these vessels and the arrogance and the sense of self-importance. And he says, "You with all of your self-importance, you have set yourself against God." And he says, "Because of that, God has sent you this message." And he points to the wall that makes the knees quiver. Now, the humorous part of this story is this isn't a secret language. It's Aramaic. And for whatever reason, nobody in the king's court knew Aramaic. Daniel knew Aramaic. And so maybe that's why he didn't take money, because he knew, like, if it gets found out that this is just another language, not something from, like, aliens, that, there's going to be retribution. And so he just begins to explain in his native tongue. He just says, this is what this means. And so he translates in verse 25, and he says, this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. Mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. That's what it means. And this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. 3 words. Mene, tekel, Perez. Numbered, weighed, and divided. Your days are numbered. In fact, he just says, King Belshazzar, your days are numbered. You're not going to live for eternity. You're not going to last forever. Your kingdom isn't going to be forever. You have a limited number of days that you are going to live your life. I know right now in this moment you're having this party and you're living like your days aren't numbered, but they are numbered. This is a sobering reality for all of us, isn't it? I once heard somebody say life is a terminal illness. It's that moment when you realize that we all die, that our days are numbered. That changes something in your perspective, right? Your days are numbered. Not exactly an encouraging statement to be made. Your days are numbered and your kingdom has been brought to an end. It's not going to last any longer. Then the second word, tekel, you've been measured. You've been measured. It's like, imagine it this way. Imagine that somebody has asked for the books of the kingdom, the accounting of the kingdom, and he lays the books out, and they start to look and say, have you kept good records of things? Let me see your spreadsheets, and let me see your QuickBook reports. And they start looking at the report of the kingdom. They're measuring. They're comparing them to a standard. And he says, you've come up short. You've been left wanting. You've been cooking the books. You've been cheating people. And ultimately, you've been cheating God. That's what he says. You've been measured, and you have come up wanting. In fact, this idea of being measured, he was the one that measured people. Belshazzar measured people. He's the one that created the standard. I love that Daniel is saying to him, there is somebody who measures beyond you. There is somebody who sets a standard that isn't the standard that you set. You are not the ultimate authority on what is right and what is good and what is valuable. And then he uses this final word, parsin, Perez, depending on how it's interpreted. It's the word divided. So literally the words are just simply numbered, weighed, and divided. It's over, divided. Your kingdom is divided. One of the most fascinating parts of this story, see, if you read in history, about a week before this moment, the Persians have circled outside the city of Babylon, and they have diverted the waters of the Euphrates River, and so that the supply of water to the city of Babylon in the week previous to this celebration was decreasing. And so Belshazzar, he's throwing this party in a sense to say, we're impenetrable. You can't defeat us. We'll live forever. There's this sense of, like, my kingdom will always last. And Daniel says, no, your days are numbered, and you've been measured, and you have been found wanting, and your kingdom is to be divided. By the way, for those of you that don't know, this is where in our culture we get the phrase, the handwriting was on the wall. Right? Which whenever somebody says that in our culture, oh, the handwriting was on the wall, or the handwriting is on the wall, it means what's about to happen next. Something bad, right? Calamity. Verse 30. Verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck. He didn't want this stuff, but he gives it to him anyways. And a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then verse 30, beautiful end of the chapter. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. The Persians invaded that night. And not to ruin what happens next, but when you open up to the next chapter, chapter 6, Daniel's still here. And the king is gone. And there's another king. And there's another empire. But Daniel is still in the story. And at some point as you walk through this, and if you've been here through this series, at some point you look at this story and you realize when it comes specifically to influence, that there is a difference between self-importance and significance, isn't there? Daniel doesn't seem to be a person of self-importance, right? He doesn't seem to be this person that culture is always elevating, but Daniel is this person of significance. Over and over again, we see him as a person of significance and a person who seems to outlast the circumstances around him. There is significance. And I believe that is why he has the influence that he has. He has significance, not self-importance. And I think the writing that happens on the wall in this story points to the issue of significance. Where do we find our significance? How do we become significant people? What does this mean to be numbered and to be measured and to be weighed? And what does all of this have to do with being a person of significance? I just want to give you 3 critical words of our own that I think associate with significance. First one is this: stewardship. Words of significance. The first one is stewardship. Whatever you have been given, it is a gift. That is something that Daniel has been saying to Nebuchadnezzar. It's something he says to Belshazzar. In the chapter, the part that I didn't get to here, there's a moment where he just says, do you not understand? Like, whatever you have, God's given it to you. There's a sense of stewardship. You are managing something that you did not create on your own. You didn't make this happen. God gave this to you. And when you realize that God gives you something, you deal with that very differently. So we apply this to people. And one of the things that I've noticed is that when a person does not see their life as a life to be lived for themselves, when a person does not see their resources as resources to be consumed for themselves, there is something about that person that is significant. Have you noticed this? When there's a person in your life and they go, you know what, my life is just not about me getting what I want or me consuming all that I want, but I'm living my life as a steward. And they navigate their life that way. They live in relationship with people. They live at their work that way. They live in their community that way. When they see themselves as a steward of something that's been given to them, there is a significance that comes with that. They have influence that comes with that because of the way they carry themselves. It's not just about them. They see this opportunity to leverage things for the good. When you realize that your life has been given to you to steward, it changes something in you. Your life has been given to you to steward. And when that happens, you will move away from a sense of self-importance. You will also move away from a sense of self-defeat. You'll find yourself a more balanced person because you realize, I have been given things to steward. How am I stewarding those things? How am I navigating these things? That's what we see in Daniel. Daniel seems to steward these circumstances and steward his own voice. He stewards, which leads really to the second thing that I see with significance, and that's this idea of temporary. I want you just to say this with me this morning. It won't last forever. Will you say that? It won't last forever. Let's say it one more time. It won't last forever. And what's the it in that sentence? Just about everything, yeah. And we have this sense that everything that we're experiencing right now it's like never going to change, right? Whatever moment we're in, and by the way, we really do this around stress and pain and heartache. We have these things where we go, man, it's never going to change. It's always going to be this way. The truth is most things change, and it will not last forever. There's a sense of what is temporary and there's a sense of what is eternal. Whenever we reverse those things, whenever we start living as if things that are temporary are eternal and things that are eternal are temporary, that messes up our wiring, doesn't it? In fact, I would say the cause of a lot of our heartache, a lot of our anxiety in life, the cause of a lot of our bad decisions in life, even the cause of a lot of our bad behavior in life is the result of us confusing temporal things with the eternal things. That we somehow start thinking, well, this is what matters and this is what's important and this moment it's not going to... We start thinking this is the most important thing. The truth is, things are going to change. Daniel is showing us this over and over and over again. There's a new king, and then before the chapter's even over, there's another new king, and Daniel's still there. People who have this concept of what is temporary and what is not, they live lives that are buoyed by that strength. So things happen in the news and things happen in politics and things happen in the world. And for some reason, people who understand that things are temporary, they have a way of navigating the circumstances of life that is very different. And as a result of that, what do they have? Influence, significance. They become significant people because they understand what matters and what doesn't matter. Which then leads to the third thing. The final word is accountable. They're accountable. There are things that matter more than this moment. The idea of being measured, this idea of measuring things, is this idea of knowing that there is a standard out there that says this is actually the way life should be lived. And I think it's interesting that for most of us, we allow the empire to determine the standard. Daniel is accountable to a standard that is outside the realm of the empire that he's in. He's accountable to a reality that is outside of the reality that he is presently in. There are things that matter more than the moment that he's in, and he sees this. And so the decisions that he makes, the way that he's living his life, he says, I'm accountable to something, but it isn't to the rules and the legislation or the values or the wins that our culture has defined for me. I'm accountable to something else. There is another book that gets laid out and it says, this is what life is all about. There's a different set of rules. What's beautiful is if you fast forward to the book of Acts, Acts chapter 16, there's a story of an individual and a story of individuals who are living this out. They're living this sort of stewarding, temporary, accountable life out. And in Acts chapter 16, the Apostle Paul, he's on a missionary journey and he's telling people about Jesus and he's starting new churches all over the Roman Empire. And he's gone to the city of Philippi. And in that city, the chapter kind of opens with them traveling and then it moves to him sharing the message of the gospel with this woman named Lydia. And she becomes a follower of Jesus and a church is birthed and they continue on in that city and they keep teaching. And then a short time later, there's another girl that enters into the story and she's a slave girl. She's possessed by demons and men actually have her sort of in bondage and they're leveraging her life to make profit from her. And so they use her. And then they liberate this woman. The power of the gospel liberates her. As a result of that, these guys who were using this woman for money, they file a complaint with the authorities and they say, these guys are ruining our economics. By the way, the gospel will mess with our economics. And so they do this, and these guys get beaten and thrown into prison. So then we're introduced to a third person, a guy that's known as the jailer. And the jailer's job is pretty simple. Make sure these guys don't escape. The problem is, middle of the night, when you read Acts chapter 16, there's an earthquake, and during the earthquake, the foundation of the prison is shaken enough that the doors of the prison cell shake loose, and their shackles come out of the walls. Which, if you are a Christian living in 2018 and you have just been imprisoned for your faith and there's an earthquake that releases you, what is your assumption? It's a miracle. God has rescued me, right? I mean, most of us today would say, I'm just going to run out of here because clearly God wants me to go somewhere else, right? That's what we would assume. Interestingly enough, in this moment, the centurion jailer knows that he's going to lose his life for those men escaping. And so he goes to take his own life. He's about to kill himself in this moment. And in the darkness, he hears Paul call out, don't kill yourself, we're all still here. So in shock, he rushes into this place, opens up the light, or lights the light, rushes in, sees him and says, what are you doing here? Why are you here? Why would you do this? Why would you value my life over your life? And how, with the way that I've treated you and the way that you've been treated in this, like how could you possibly do this? And then he says this iconic thing to them. He says, what must I do to be saved? And it wasn't because they preached a message, and it wasn't because they healed him, it wasn't because they gave him money. It was because he looked at people who had a sense of what was eternal. He looked at people who had a sense of they were stewarding their lives. He looked at people who had an accountability to something beyond the values of culture. These men in this prison, they lived beyond this moment because they were impacted by the gospel. See, the question is, how do we become people who steward our lives? How do we become people who see the eternal versus the temporal? How do we become people that are accountable not to our culture standards, but to a different set of standards? And the answer is the gospel. Every time that you and I look at the gospel of Jesus, it makes a proclamation over our lives. And it says, you are infinitely valuable. You are valuable. The gospel of Jesus says you're a valuable person. You're not worthless. You're a valuable person. You have influence. You have meaning. A life was given for yours. That elevates our understanding of who we are. And when we begin to understand our value, we begin to steward our lives differently. When we understand what Christ has done for us, it causes me to think, man, if he's done that for me, then how can I live in a way that reflects the value that I have? And I become a steward. Not only that, I become aware of what's eternal. We sing this morning about the grave being overcome and that death cannot even stop us. All of that speaks to a reality that extends beyond the one that we are presently in. There is a life that is beyond this life. There is a reality beyond this reality. There is more going on than what we can see. The gospel makes that known to us. Every time we look at the gospel, it says, no matter the circumstance I'm in right now, this is not all that there is. And so we hold loosely to things that used to derail us and take us down. And it makes us people who are accountable to something different. When I look at the cross and what Jesus has done for me, it just simply says, well, what can I do for him? I live my life defined by what the gospel says about who I am, but also what it's done for me. It's liberated me. And so how do I live my life accountable to a way of living and a way of thinking that's different than our culture? So the gospel does this to us. So imagine with me, imagine a few people like us living among hundreds of thousands of people, which is what we're doing. We're a minority. People say, you're a big church. We're a small church when you think about the size of our culture around us in this city. But imagine a small group of us who begin to let the gospel impact our hearts. We let the gospel begin to impact us in a powerful way. We begin to understand our influence, and we begin to live lives of significance, and we start to steward our lives, and we live with a sense of the eternal, and we're accountable to something different. And imagine if you and I begin to take that seriously, and we don't discard our amount of influence, but we embrace it, and we carry that into the places where we go to school and the places where we work. The people that we interact with, we start realizing all those small things really do matter, and we allow the gospel to shape those things. It will change an office, and it will change a campus, and it will change a neighborhood, and it will change a city, and ultimately it will change a region. That is what it means to be an influential minority. That is the story that Daniel is proclaiming to us. Amen? Would you stand with me? In a moment, we're going to sing the doxology together. After we do that, there are people that will be down front to pray with you. And I said this last week, and I want to say it again. And I've said it a long time, but we really want to be available to pray with you and pray for you, to offer you guidance, to do whatever, just to talk to somebody. We want to be able to do that for you. And so after the service, there'll be some folks down front with little name badges on, and that's what they're there for. So if you want to hang out and talk to them, you can. But as we close, would you join me and let's sing together? Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above, ye heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. May you be men and women who understand what it means to live a life of stewardship. May you see the eternal, and may you be accountable to something greater and far more life-giving than the values that are defined by our culture. Amen? Amen. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you guys next Sunday as we continue on.